Submachine guns defined close-quarters combat in World War II, transforming ordinary infantrymen into devastating trench sweepers. Today, we are ranking and explaining every single submachine gun utilized across the global conflict. United States of America, kicking off our list. We have the United States M1928I-1 Thompson submachine gun. This iconic weapon was heavily utilized early in the war and retained the classic lines of the Tommy gun. It featured a complex blish-lock blowback system and a heavy finned barrel for cooling. Chambered in the massive 45 caliber cartridge, it offered unparalleled stopping power in tight environments. While soldiers could use 50-round drum magazines, they quickly found them prone to rattling and jamming. Because of its extreme weight and high production cost, the military rapidly sought a simplified replacement. Next, we have the simplified United States M1 and M1A1 Thompson submachine gun. To meet massive wartime demand, engineers stripped down the original design to make it vastly cheaper. They replaced the complex blish-lock with a highly reliable direct blowback operation. The heavy finned barrel was swapped for a smooth one, and the receiver only accepted sticked magazines. Despite these cost-saving measures, it still weighed over 10 pounds when fully loaded. However, its devastating 45 caliber punch kept it beloved by paratroopers and assault troops globally. Let us continue with the United States M3 and M3A1 grease gun. Designed as an ultra-cheap replacement for the Thompson, this weapon was stamped completely out of sheet metal. It earned its famous nickname because the crude tubular receiver closely resembled a standard mechanic's grease gun. Firing the heavy 45 caliber cartridge, it operated at a sluggish 450 rounds per minute. This remarkably slow rate actually made the weapon incredibly easy to control during fully automatic firing. The later A1 variant simplified the design even further by removing the charging handle entirely. Moving right along, we examine the United States Rising M50 and M55 submachine gun. This relatively obscure weapon was heavily adopted by the Marine Corps when Thompsons were in short supply. It fired from a closed bolt, making it highly accurate for that crucial first shot. Unfortunately, the complex internal mechanism proved to be a massive liability in the sandy conditions of Guadalcanal. The weapon jammed with alarming frequency when exposed to dirt, frustrating Marines in combat. It was ultimately withdrawn from frontline service as quickly as better weapons became available. Next on our breakdown is the United Defense N42 submachine gun. Originally designed as a Thompson replacement, it was ultimately rejected by the regular American military. Instead, the Office of Strategic Services purchased these precise weapons to supply partisan resistance groups. It was uniquely chambered in 9mm, allowing resistance fighters to use captured German ammunition. The weapon was highly regarded for its precision machining and clever magazines that welded face to face. Dropped largely from airplanes into occupied territory, it remains one of the rarest American firearms today. Great Britain and Commonwealth forces. Transitioning to British weapons, we have the Sten Mark I submachine gun. When Great Britain found itself desperately short of weapons after Dunkirk, engineers rapidly developed this firearm. The Mark I was the original production model featuring a tubular receiver and a wooden handguard, chambered in 9mm. It fed from a 32-round magazine that became its visual hallmark. It was deliberately designed to be manufactured quickly in crude bicycle shops and light industrial factories. While somewhat unrefined, it successfully armed a vulnerable nation when a German invasion seemed imminent. Let us move forward with the highly famous Sten Mark II submachine gun. This is the most widely produced variant of the Sten family, with over 2 million units manufactured. Engineers aggressively stripped away the wooden parts to create a purely utilitarian, mass-production masterpiece. The weapon could be easily disassembled and hidden, making it an absolute favorite for resistance fighters. While frontline troops often mocked it as a plumber's nightmare, its simple open bolt design was deadly. Its extreme ease of manufacture allowed the British to heavily disrupt German supply lines. Next up is the British Sten Mark III submachine gun. This variant represented an attempt to streamline the manufacturing process even further to during extreme wartime economy. Engineers created a single welded tube that served as both the receiver and the barrel shroud. Because the barrel was permanently welded into the casing, it could not be easily replaced in the field. The magazine housing was also fixed directly to the receiver, unlike the rotating housing of the Mark II. While slightly cheaper to produce, the lack of replaceable parts made it less popular with soldiers. Continuing our catalogue, we have the refined British Sten Mark V submachine gun. Introduced late in 1944, this version was designed to be a higher quality weapon for paratroopers. It vastly improved ergonomics by adding a wooden pistol grip, a wooden stock, and a forward grip. The front sight was upgraded, and it was fitted with a lug to accept a standard bayonet. These additions made the weapon heavier, but transformed the crude Sten into a genuinely reliable firearm. This was the exact weapon carried by British airborne forces during the daring drops into Arnhem. Next, we examine the British Lanchester Mark I and Mark I Star submachine guns. Before the Sten existed, the Royal Navy desperately needed a submachine gun for guarding ports. To save time, British engineers effectively created a direct copy of the German MP40. It featured a beautifully machined brass magazine, a wooden stock, and a massive bayonet lug. The Mark I Star was a simplified version that replaced complicated sights with a fixed aperture. While incredibly heavy, it was a remarkably sturdy and smooth-firing weapon that served the Navy faithfully. Moving to the Commonwealth forces, let us look at the Australian Owen machine carbine. Designed by an eccentric amateur inventor, this quickly became arguably the best submachine gun of the Pacific. Its most recognizable feature is the top-mounted magazine, which allowed gravity to assist the feeding process. It was specifically engineered to survive the brutal, mud-soaked environment of the New Guinea jungles. The weapon featured an isolated bolt compartment that kept dirt entirely out of the operating mechanism. Australian troops absolutely loved this odd-looking weapon and refused to trade it for anything else. Next, we have the Australian Austin submachine gun. The name was a simple combination of Australia and Sten, perfectly describing its engineering heritage. While troops demanded the Owen gun, bureaucrats pushed for the Austin because its stamped metal design was cheaper. It incorporated features from the German MP40, including a folding metal stock and mainspring enclosure. Despite these design influences, the weapon proved to be vastly inferior in harsh tropical combat zones. It suffered from severe reliability issues in the mud and was generally disliked by the soldiers. Nazi Germany. Shifting to Nazi Germany, we start with the Maschinen Pistol 38. This revolutionary weapon entirely changed global design by completely eliminating traditional wooden stocks. Instead, it was constructed from machined steel and synthetic plastic, featuring a folding under-barrel metal stock. It fired standard 9mm cartridges from a 32-round straight magazine that doubled as a grip. Originally issued exclusively to paratroopers and tank crews, its devastating effectiveness quickly created massive infantry demand. However, the intricate machining required made it far too expensive, forcing engineers to seek cheaper alternatives. Next on the list is the legendary German Maschinen Pistol 40. This weapon took the brilliant design of the 38 and adapted it for massive industrial production. Engineers replaced the heavy machined steel receiver with stamped sheet metal to drastically reduce manufacturing time. Often erroneously called the Schmeisser by Allied troops, it became the visual symbol of the German infantrymen. Firing at 500 rounds per minute, it was highly accurate in close-quarters urban combat. Its only fatal flaw was a double-column single-feed magazine that frequently jammed when dirty. Let us continue with the German Maschinen Pistol 41. This weapon was a strange hybrid designed by Hugo Schmeisser to combine modern elements with older traditions. It utilized the stamp receiver and bolt of the MP40, but grafted them onto a solid wooden stock. It also featured a selective fire trigger mechanism, allowing soldiers to switch between semi and fully automatic fire. The regular German army rejected it, preferring the compact folding stock of their standard-issue weapons. Consequently, it was primarily issued to police units and Axis Allied forces operating on the Eastern Front. Moving along, we have the German Maschinen Pistol 34. Manufactured primarily in Austria before the war, historians often cite this as the Rolls-Royce of submachine guns. It was machined from massive blocks of top-grade steel to incredibly tight tolerances for flawless reliability. It featured a beautifully crafted wooden stock and a side-mounted magazine, that doubled as a loading tool. The heavy weight of the steel absorbed nearly all recoil, allowing for pinpoint accuracy during automatic fire. As the war dragged on, weapons of this peacetime quality were entirely phased out for cheaper designs. Next, we look at the German MP40. This was a direct evolution of the very first World War I submachine gun, heavily modernized for a new conflict. The most significant upgrade was replacing the awkward snail drum with a highly reliable 32-round stick magazine. It also introduced a selective fire capability to help troops conserve ammunition during prolonged engagements. Constructed with heavy machined steel and a full wooden stock, it was rugged but extremely heavy. While completely obsolete by 1939, it was heavily used by rear echelon occupation forces. Let us examine the Irma EMP-35 submachine gun. Designed by Heinrich Vollmer, this prominent interwar design saw extensive action in the Spanish Civil War. It is instantly recognizable by its sturdy wooden stock and prominent vertical wooden foregrip beneath the barrel. Firing from an open bolt, it fed from the left side and utilized a unique telescoping mainspring tube. While bypassed for standard army issue, massive stockpiles were purchased and utilized heavily by the S. As superior weapons became available, it was slowly relegated to secondary units and partisan hunting squads. Next in the German arsenal is the desperate Maschinenpistole 3008, produced in the absolute dying months of the war. This was a crude weapon designed to arm the civilian militia. Facing total industrial collapse, German engineers effectively copied the ultra-cheap British Sten gun using scrap metal. The only major design difference was a vertically rotated magazine, that accepted standard MP40 magazines. The welds were sloppy, the metal was unpolished, and the weapons lacked any protective rust finish. It perfectly symbolized the desperate final gasp of the Nazi war machine as Allied armies closed in. Soviet Union. Transitioning to the Soviet Union, we start with the PPD-3438 submachine gun. Designed by Vasily Degayev, this was the first submachine gun to see widespread service in the Red Army. It was heavily inspired by German designs, featuring a traditional wooden stock and a heavy milled steel receiver. The harsh lessons of the Winter War forced engineers to adapt it to accept high-capacity drum magazines. Because it required highly skilled machining techniques, it was incredibly difficult to mass-produce in large numbers. The weapon ultimately served as the critical design stepping stone for the legendary Soviet weapons that followed. Next, we have the Soviet PT-40 submachine gun. This was a rapid modification of the earlier Degayev design, attempting to integrate the 71-round drum. The front of the wooden stock was cut into two pieces, allowing the large drum to snap directly into the receiver. It fired the screaming fast Tokarev cartridge, which possessed phenomenal armor-penetrating capabilities against heavy winter clothing. Despite improvements in firepower, it still suffered from crippling manufacturing bottlenecks that required expensive milled steel. Production was quickly abandoned shortly after the German invasion, making it a very rare sight in combat. Let us continue with the absolute titan of the Eastern Front, the Soviet PPSh-41. Recognizing previous models were too slow to build, engineer Georgy Shpalgin brilliantly redesigned the weapon using cheap, stamped metal. The result was a rugged, almost indestructible firearm that could be manufactured rapidly by unskilled labor. Firing at an astonishing 900 rounds per minute, it drowned German defenders in a wall of lead. The massive 71-round drum magazine became its legendary trademark throughout the brutal urban meatgrinder of Stalingrad. With over 6 million units produced, it was unequivocally the weapon that turned the tide in the East. Moving right along, we examine the Soviet PPSh-42 submachine gun. Designed during the horrific siege of Leningrad, this weapon represents the absolute pinnacle of wartime desperation and efficiency. Because the besieged city lacked heavy machinery, it was designed entirely from simple stamped sheet metal. It featured a top-folding metal stock and completely eliminated heavy drum magazines for reliable 35-round sticks, firing at a controllable 600 rounds per minute. It was significantly lighter and more accurate than its predecessors. These weapons were rushed straight from localized factories directly into the frozen trenches defending the starving city. Next on our list is the Soviet PPSh-43 submachine gun. This weapon refined the brilliant Sudaev design by slightly shortening the barrel to create arguably the best submachine gun of the war. The manufacturing process was optimized so perfectly that it took less than half the raw materials of older models. Its compact size and extreme reliability made it the absolute perfect weapon for Soviet tank crews and paratroopers. Unlike other cheap stamped metal weapons of the era, it was incredibly safe and suffered almost zero mechanical failures. Modern firearms experts widely consider it to be the finest masterpiece of stamped steel engineering ever produced. Kingdom of Italy. Transitioning to the Kingdom of Italy, we have the Moschetto Automatico Beretta Modello 1938. This beautifully crafted firearm is widely regarded by historians as one of the highest quality Italian weapons produced. It featured a solid wooden stock, an intricate machined receiver, and a highly unique dual trigger system. Pulling the front trigger fired single shots, while pulling the rear trigger instantly unleashed fully automatic fire. Fire in a specialized high-velocity cartridge, it was remarkably accurate at ranges that outclassed standard submachine guns. It was so highly prized on the battlefield that German paratroopers actively scavenged them from their Italian allies. Let us continue with the simplified Italian MAB 38, 42 and 44 variants. Because the original weapon was far too expensive, Beretta engineers heavily streamlined the design for wartime production. They completely shortened the heavy wooden stock and replaced the costly machined receiver with stamped metal components. Despite these aggressive cost-cutting measures, the weapon incredibly retained its dual-trigger mechanism and legendary reliability. The 44 variant simplified the bolt mechanism even further to speed up late-war manufacturing output. These highly capable weapons remained in heavy use by both fascist forces and communist partisans in the mountains. Next, we examine the obscure Italian FNA B-43 submachine gun. Manufactured exclusively in German-controlled regions of northern Italy, this weapon was an extremely complex engineering outlier. It utilized a highly unusual lever-delayed blowback system and fired from a closed bolt for supreme accuracy. The weapon featured a sturdy folding metal stock and a magazine well that cleverly pivoted flush against the barrel. Because of its intense precision machining requirements, only about 7,000 units were ever successfully produced. It was primarily issued to high-ranking German and fascist Italian units, operating in the final chaotic months. Moving right along, we have the Italian TZ-45 submachine gun. Designed by brothers Tonnen and Zorzoli, this was a desperate attempt to create an ultra-cheap firearm. It was cobbled together almost entirely from crude stamped steel components, visually resembling a sloppy Sten gun. Its most notable design feature was an unusual grip safety located behind the magazine well that required firm pressure. Despite this safety feature, the overall build quality was incredibly poor and it suffered severe reliability issues. Only roughly 6,000 were produced, symbolizing the total destruction of Italy's once proud domestic firearms industry. Next up is the Italian OVP 1918, a true legacy weapon. This bizarre firearm was actually a leftover relic from the First World War, adapted from an aircraft machine gun. Italian engineers mounted a single receiver onto a traditional wooden rifle stock and issued it to infantrymen. It retained the incredibly awkward top-mounted magazine and utilized an extremely high cyclic rate of fire. While totally obsolete by the time the Second World War erupted, desperate Italian forces still utilized massive stockpiles. It stands as a fascinating historical bridge between the very first automatic weapons and modern submachine guns. Empire of Japan. Shifting our focus to the Empire of Japan, we start with the early 1940 Type 100. The Imperial Japanese Army heavily prioritized bolt-action rifles, making this their only widely produced submachine gun. It was a well-crafted weapon featuring a solid wooden stock, a complex bipod, and an awkward curved side magazine. Bizarrely, Japanese military doctrine insisted that the weapon be fitted with a massive, heavy bayonet lug for melee combat. Chambered in the notoriously underpowered 8mm Nambu cartridge, it severely lacked modern stopping power. Because generals viewed automatic weapons as a waste of ammunition, only a few thousand of this early variant were manufactured. Let us look at the late 1944 simplified variant of the Japanese Type 100. As the American island-hopping campaign systematically destroyed Japanese industry, engineers completely abandoned their high peacetime standards. They removed the useless bipod, roughly welded the sights into a fixed position, and left the metal entirely unpolished. The rate of fire was dramatically increased to 800 rounds per minute to give defenders maximum ambush firepower. Despite these drastic shortcuts, it still fired the weak Nambu cartridge against heavily armed American troops. These crude weapons were heavily utilized during the bloody final defensive stands on islands like Iwo Jima. Republic of Finland. Moving to the Republic of Finland, we examine the legendary Suomi KP-31. This immaculate Finnish masterpiece is widely considered to be the most accurate submachine gun of the early war. Machined to absolute perfection, its heavy steel construction completely negated recoil during fully automatic bursts. It utilized a revolutionary 71-round drum magazine that was incredibly reliable in freezing temperatures. The weapon featured a quick detach barrel system, allowing a soldier to swap an overheated barrel in seconds. Its brutal effectiveness during the Winter War single-handedly forced the Soviet Union to completely change its military doctrine. France. Transitioning to France, we have the MAS-38 submachine gun. This highly distinct weapon featured a strange angled receiver where the bolt recoiled down a tube inside the wooden stock. This bizarre engineering choice delayed the blowback mechanism just enough to keep the weapon incredibly compact and controllable. It fired the unique French Longueuil cartridge, which was significantly less powerful than standard 9mm rounds. Produced right as the war began, only a small number were manufactured before France surrendered to the Blitzkrieg. The occupying German forces happily confiscated the remaining factory stock to issue to their own occupation police. Minor powers and resistance forces. Next on our breakdown, we look at minor powers with the Romanian Arita M1941. Designed with assistance from Czech engineers, this highly capable weapon was adopted by the Romanian Royal Army. It was a well-constructed firearm featuring a machined receiver and a wooden stock that mirrored early European aesthetics. Chambered in standard 9mm, it was a highly reliable open-bolt design that performed exceptionally well in combat. Romanian troops utilized it heavily, alongside their German allies during the disastrous campaigns surrounding the siege of Stalingrad. It was considered such a successful design that the military continued to use modified variants well into the Cold War. Let us continue with the Hungarian Danuvia 39M and 43M submachine guns. Designed by Pal Kirili, these weapons looked much more like traditional full-sized military rifles than submachine guns. They utilized an incredibly complex lever-delayed blowback system, which was highly unusual for pistol-caliber weapons. Firing the extremely powerful Mauser export round gave them a much longer effective range than standard 9mm firearms. The 39M featured a massive wooden stock, while the later variant utilized a folding metal stock for paratroopers. Though beautifully engineered, the complex delayed blowback system proved overly sensitive to dirt and freezing mud. Next we have the Polish Mors WZ-39 submachine gun. The word Mors translates to walrus in Polish, and this was intended to be the standard weapon for their modernizing army. It was a well-crafted traditional design featuring a wooden stock and a bottom-feeding magazine. Interestingly, it featured a telescoping monopod hidden inside the forward grip to stabilize the weapon during trench warfare. Unfortunately, the weapon was barely out of the prototype phase when Germany aggressively invaded Poland in 1939. only about 50 of these weapons were ever produced, making it one of the rarest firearms of the entire conflict. Finally, wrapping up our comprehensive list, we have the Polish Błyskawica submachine gun. The name translates to lightning, and it holds the distinction of being the only weapon mass produced covertly in occupied Europe. Designed by the Home Army, it was secretly manufactured in underground basements right under the noses of the Gestapo. It was heavily inspired by the British Sten gun for simplicity, but utilized an aluminum folding stock copied from the Germans. The resistance fighters fueled the weapon entirely with 9mm ammunition stolen directly from dead German soldiers. Roughly 700 were built and successfully used during the Warsaw Uprising, standing as a legendary testament to bravery.